morning, everyone. Today's scripture is in Luke 18 through 8. 1 through 8, excuse me. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says, and will not grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night. Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant them justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?"
Did you notice that was a parable? The writer of the Gospel of Luke valued greatly the parables that he believed Jesus had told. Now, parables are stories, and we have to understand they're stories on purpose. But they're stories that are told about things that do happen, or you don't have to use your imagination to actually see them happening in the world or in your life. The parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance. You know, anybody can walk down a road and see somebody hurt at the side. This parable is really no different. So we're going to spend a few minutes now dissecting this parable so that we can hear it the way that Jesus' followers in his time would have heard it. Now, put on your Jewish listening ears. Seriously. That entire Bible that we read from was written by Jews for Jews. So if we're going to get something out of reading it, we have to understand what these words meant for them. Now, who can tell me the status of a widow in those days, in that society? Lower than low. Nothing. If they didn't have sons, they really were nothing. Legally, widows, because they were women, but especially because they were widows, had no rights. Did you know that? No rights. They were at the mercy of others, taking care of them, their sons if they had them, but if they didn't, others taking care of them, taking pity on them, those kinds of things. That didn't mean that a widow, for instance, couldn't agree with someone that she would clean their house, and then they would pay her so much. It didn't mean that a widow couldn't make deals like that, that for their own labor they would get paid, or just anything like that. Or maybe somehow they had inherited something from somebody. It's hard to imagine because women couldn't inherit hardly anything. But let's say they had some jewelry and they wanted to sell it so they have money to eat with, okay? They could do that. But of course, if somebody says, "Well, I'll pay you 500 denarii for that jewelry," and you say, "It's worth 1,000, okay, 750, you get the bargain, you give the jewelry, and they give you 500. You've been cheated, haven't you? There's an injustice being done. So, this woman who had no legal rights, this woman who's a widow, who's lower than low, goes before a judge because somebody is cheating her. Somebody is bringing injustice to her. Now, isn't that what judges are for? You bring a case before a judge. In fact, it's interesting to me that in our own legal system, we still have that much of a requirement. You can't just sue somebody unless you can, at least in the pleading, say that, well, they've done a wrong to me. They've injured me. Or they're doing something that's going to injure me. You have to have a case. There's no question that in this parable, the widow has a case. We aren't told that she's not telling the truth or anything like that. Am I right? She's being cheated by somebody. Now, the judge. The judge. What a good guy, huh? I mean, what do we know about this judge? He has no concern for people or God or the law either. Justice. He has no concern for justice, no concern for human beings. I knew some of them when I practiced law. I really did. You know how you can get that way? How can you get so that you don't really have a concern for the law, for human beings, for God, for anything like that? How can you get that way? Power. Judges have a lot of power. They really do. They get to choose what they hear or what they don't hear, even though it was said to them. Ever think of that? In other words, I care about that, but I don't care about that, so I'm going to give this side, Judges come out finally with some kind of a verdict. Yeah, you think there's a jury verdict. Well, yeah, if you can have a jury in our system. They didn't have that back then. But still, the judge decides the solution to the verdict. That's power. So if you're a judge in any kind of society, you got all kinds of power. And this is one who happens to not give a you-know-what about anything. I'm just going to sit there and I'll use my power however I want. I don't care. What a great guy. Now, for most of us, let's be honest, we'd go one time to that judge and we'd get treated so horribly, we'd never go back. Just give up, wouldn't we? I mean, what chance do we have? The judge has the power. We don't have any. And the judge tells me to leave the courtroom, so am I going to go back? Probably not. Probably not. But tell me about the widow. What did she do? She kept going back. The judge couldn't just sit in the chambers and smoke a cigar and have a drink or something like that. Had to keep coming out on the bench and tell her to get out of his courtroom. She kept coming and coming. What's the word for that? Persistent. She was persistent in her search for justice. That's very unusual in these parables. You won't find hardly any other of Jesus' parables that are that specific about what the story is talking. Really. You just won't find them. Usually a parable is not about the story itself, but about something that's beyond the story, love or sacrifice or something like that. And yet this is about justice and injustice, and those who have the power to make an injustice into justice. That's what this parable is about. Now, other than judges, who has this kind of power? Kings. This isn't a trick question, honest. Now think about it. Who has the power to do good or not to do good in our society? Who? Parents. Good. Supreme Court. Doctors. How about politicians? How about legislators? No, but seriously, there's a lot of power to go around, isn't there? Think of it that way. So this parable has to do with persons in power and their ability to deal with justice and injustice. But even more than that, it's important that we're told something very specific about the powerful person who can deal with this. What do we know about this judge again? The judge doesn't care. No concern for justice or for persons or for God or for anything, just his power. Okay? Now, so in one of the stories, meanings of this story for us is that we're going to be up against other persons at some stage of our life, as a church, as individuals, as couples, as children, as whoever. We're going to be up against persons with power. And it's against, because they aren't necessarily going to be for us. And we're going to be in a position where we want them to correct that which is wrong. That's what this story is about. Now, so for Israel, for those Jewish people that are hearing this parable, what might they be thinking? Who's the judge in this parable for them? Rome. The Roman government. Huh? I mean, they're actually in power. Remember, they come and kill them every once in a while just to remind them who's in power and stuff like that. Who else in their own Jewish history? The Babylonians, the Assyrians. They took over after a war and they enslaved Israel. Remember, the Israelites had to go into exile once to the Babylonians and things like that. So this can happen in many different ways, where we have to deal with the fact that we don't have all the power, but those with power are the only ones that can fix something. Injustice, right or wrong, do some good. Ever thought of that? Ever thought of that? Now, why would the gospel writer want us to know that Jesus told this parable? Why? It's the only one that's so narrow of all the parables. It's the only one that really harps on injustice and those who don't really have the power in themselves to fix it. Why? You shouldn't give up? Well, good will eventually come, maybe, but it's not going to come by itself, is it, in this parable? If the widow hadn't been persistent, what's the only thing that we know would have happened? She would have kept being cheated. The cheater would have gotten away with it. The injustice would have been given life because it was left alone. But she wouldn't leave it alone. Now, let's be fair. The injustice was being done to her, okay? So maybe it's a little bit easier to be persistent about it if it's happening directly to us. What are we taught as Christians, though, about the other? As you would have them, okay? Love them as yourself. Okay, who don't we care about? Ooh, there's a trick question. Who don't we care about? That's not what we're in business for, is it? That's what the parable of Good Samaritan was about. That smart young lawyer said, well, how do I know who my neighbor is? Oh, you're asking the wrong question. If I tell you who your neighbor is, then you can decide who your neighbor isn't. No, the question is who acted as a neighbor, remember? That's the right question. How can I act as a neighbor? That's the way the rabbis taught back then. That's the way parables work. Sometimes the parable is trying to teach us that we aren't asking the right questions. Sometimes the parable tries to teach us that we don't always have the solution in our hands, but it's something we have to work for because we believe in it. Now, I am still proud as I really am getting near the end of my pastoral ministry, as it said in the letter. I am. But I will retire as a minister in good standing, or at least in full standing, of the United Church of Christ, and I'm proud of that. What little money our denomination still gets, which is very little anymore, it has used in some instances. It joined in a lawsuit, for instance, in North Carolina 2 years ago, because, would you believe this? The North Carolina legislature passed a law that said if any preachers preach about politics, we're taking away their nonprofit thing. In other words, the state's going to tell ministers what they can preach about in church. Now, come on, in America, you can't do that. That's wrong, but who's going to question the legislator? The United Church of Christ, along with a few other denominations, did. It was a really easy case for the federal court. They said, you can't do that, you idiots. They didn't say idiots, but they said something along those lines. You know, you can't do that. You cannot tell any religious body what to discuss, what to think about, what to believe. Now, I'm proud of that. I'm glad that I'm part of a denomination that won't just sit back and let injustices happen. Okay? And maybe that's not even the best example I can give, but we don't. That's been part of our religious tradition forever. That's why we were such an integral part of the Underground Railroad. That's why we have always been such a part in Appalachia, in ministries in Appalachia. Because you talk about poor people. You talk about people that they can't even understand what power is anymore. Remember the Hillbilly Elegy book? If you haven't read it, fine. There's some more good ones coming out now. One of them's called White Trash. That's the name of the book. Read them. It's more about power and no power than it is about anything. We are called by Christ. We are called by our own religious tradition to understand that we cannot sit by when injustice is right in front of our faces. Now, you heard the way I said that. We cannot sit by when injustice is right in front of our faces. What's an interesting technique we could use to make sure that doesn't happen? Yeah, thank you. Make sure we're always looking the other way. Make sure that as soon as we see it, we look away. We have, on Thursday nights, a meal for the community. And it's working out so well, isn't it? And people come that we hadn't even anticipated. Isn't that true? The whole body, mind, spirit thing comes out, and it's just food, but still, it does. And one of the reasons we started leaning toward that as our call to community ministry was because we knew there's so many of our members who either are still working in the school system or have worked in the school system, that isn't it more than 50% of the kids are on reduced or free lunches in one of the schools anyway? Is it? Overall, yeah. There's a lot of kids that are going hungry. Right here, we know that. Way back in the 1970s, I thought the other day, oh my goodness, that's getting close to 50 years ago now, 1970 is. A man named Harry Chapin. How many of you remember Harry Chapin's songs and stuff? Yeah, my idol. Harry Chapin and his group gave away a significant portion of the money they took in at every concert for what? Do any of you know? Food for the World. And he would go on his soapbox every concert at some point in the middle of the concert and say, how can it be in this country that 8 million kids go to bed hungry every night? How can that be? So I ask you, how can that be? How can that be? You know, one of the ways that we subsidize the cost of farmers' food and enable it to be sold at a higher price, you know one of the ways we do it? We destroy tons and tons and tons of it every year. Now, there's an idea. It works in terms of the price, but what else happens? Millions of kids go to bed hungry every night. And we talk about, well, we don't want to put them on welfare. Do you know that? Are you aware of that? Because if you weren't, you are now. How do we sit by and let that happen? We aren't sitting by here, but that's not enough, is it? How can we become a pain in the pick your body part to those in power about justice? There's all kinds of justice. It's really fascinating because I studied ethics in college, and I thought I knew what justice was. You know, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, or it's fairness. Oh no, there's so many kinds of justice. There's retributive justice. That's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You know, somebody does something to you, you do the same thing back to them. There's distributive justice. Anybody know what that is? Distributive justice. It's when those in power are able to see the whole picture of all the society, and they take whatever goods and wealth there is and they distribute it in some kind of an equitable way. So everybody has enough. That sounds pretty nice, doesn't it? How many of you ever read the Communist Manifesto? No, did you? If you read it, you know that's what Marx and Engels talked about. I mean, they were such crazy idealists, it could have never worked. But that's what they were talking about. Hey, it's the government's job to make sure everybody has enough. Adam Smith, you know who Adam Smith was? He was the first person that wrote down the theory of capitalism. He also said that. He said that the ultimate goal of capitalism is not wealth, that's just the way to the end of prosperity for all. Did you know that that's what he wrote? That's what he believed. It wasn't making people rich, it was making everybody prosperous. Not everybody had to be the same, but everybody had to have enough. Look at, we can make arguments against injustice, and I'm just talking about financial injustice. We can do it. There's all kinds of ways to do it, but we have to be willing and able as followers of Christ to be like he said we should be. We need to be persistent partisans. Partisans not for ourselves so much. Partisans for those in need, for those who have not, for those who are powerless. Persistently, we need to do that. I fear for my grandchildren's world that those who call themselves Christians are not and will not be doing that enough in our world. I fear for my grandchildren's worlds that I'll be gone from. I fear that they won't even know how to do it themselves unless we start becoming better and better at being partisans for those that aren't powerful. Those with ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.